Taking up where we left off, we've looked at the first of the three boundary disputes settled during the 1840s. That would be the Maine boundary, settled by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842. Okay. The next one, in point of the timeline, would be the situation about Oregon country. This runs from the present northern boundary of California up to the southern tip of Alaska. Okay, Alaska was internationally recognized as a property of Russia at the time. They would later sell it to the United States. But it's the Pacific Northwest plus the Canadian province, roughly, of British Columbia, I believe. All right. That was inhabited by Native Americans. The only other people out there were a small number, probably no more than 1,500 to 2,000 people involved in the fur trade. All right. The British claim on the area dated all the way back to 1579 when Sir Francis Drake made his little round the world cruise. The United States had a bit of a claim to the southern part of it because John Jacob Astor's company had established a settlement called Astoria. They too were involved in the fur trade. That was about it. Okay, the U.S. and Britain had agreed on sort of a joint administration that they would an agreement to be renewed annually. Either one could opt out with a year's notice. The vast majority of people out there were Native Americans who didn't recognize either one. All right. Then by the early 1840s, much larger numbers of Americans began to move out there along the famous Oregon Trail. And for a little bit more detail on that, consult the supplements. That'll explain about that. I don't need to explain it again here, but the time had come to settle this. The United States, some people in the United States, expansionists, wanted all of it, all the way up to 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude, southern tip of Alaska. If we had pressed that claim and it held up, and we did go on and buy Alaska later, if that had gone through, Canada would have no Pacific Ocean frontage. Doesn't have that much as it is. But the real sticking point had to do with the fact that the United States actually was political, bluster notwithstanding. The United States government was prepared to simply extend a boundary line drawn in 1819, which is actually the present boundary between the U.S. and Canada west of the Great Lakes region, that only went to the Columbia River at the time, just to extend that out to the Pacific. We would settle for that. Britain, however, wanted at least the north shore of the Columbia River. It's a very important river for commerce and the economic development of the region, and so that was the sticking point. There was starting to be talk of war in the early 1840s, and the British government finally came to its senses. They wouldn't want to fight another war with the United States over something that far away, and the disputed area wasn't that big anyway. So in 1846, they agreed to go along with what we wanted to do and drew the boundary as it is now. Vancouver Island, it's a large island just off the coast up there. They retain all of that. So, but this 1846 agreement gave the United States Pacific Ocean frontage for the very first time along the coast. And only 2 years later, we would acquire a great deal more. So, the third dispute to be settled was the southern boundary of Texas. This is a much more complex tale, and I'm going to refer you to the supplements about how this whole thing about Texas came about. Texas was part of the Spanish Empire from the early 1500s on down to the early 1800s. It was part of Mexico, and Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821. Now, again, like the Pacific Northwest, the vast majority of people who lived in what's now Texas were Native Americans, various tribes from the Caddos to the Comanches, the Apaches, and so on. Okay. Um, the Mexican government, just as it was getting established in 1821, decided to implement a plan that the Spanish had cooked up of populating Texas with selected people from the United States. Okay, here's the situation. Mexico claimed a vast area of Texas, what's now New Mexico, Colorado, part of Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, California, all of that was part of Mexico, but they did not have a population on the ground out there. So their claim was old, but it was really pretty much just ink on a map. Meanwhile, they're facing this human juggernaut, this human tsunami of people starting to flood westward out of the United States. What are you going to do? How are you going to hold on to that when you don't have anybody out there to stabilize your claim? Hence, allowing Americans to come settle. So that went into effect in 1821, and a number of colonies, about 8 of them, were established in what's now southeastern Texas by various impresarios or contractors, the main one of whom was a man named Stephen F. Austin. Um, in fact, he was familiar with this because his father, Moses Austin, had participated in the same thing I'm about to describe in what's now southeastern Missouri in the 1790s, before the United States acquired that area. What they would do is allow settlers from the United States to settle in Texas, give them land grants, and they just had to agree to 2 things. They had to become Mexican citizens. They had to become Roman Catholics. Having done that, you're good to go. And if this sounds like 4th and 99 with 3 seconds to go, pretty much describes it. Anyway, between 1821 and the mid-1830s, around 30,000 people, most of them from the southern United States, had settled in southeastern Texas. They couldn't settle within a certain number of miles of the Gulf of Mexico. It's mainly between the Brazos and Trinity Rivers. All right. The road was a bit rocky. That's not a large population. They were a state, a Mexican state with so few people that they shared a government with the neighboring state of Coahuila. But these people are nearly all American Southerners, and the closest Hispanic population was less than 5,000 people, separated by a considerable area of unsettled land down in San Antonio. Okay, cut to the chase. In 1835 and 36, the Texians, as they called themselves, declared their independence from Mexico. Okay, this was not. This was bi-ethnic. Okay, a dictator, a very unpopular dictator, taken over the government of Mexico, known to the Texians as Santa Anna, and when he took over and trashed out the constitution of that country, rebellion sprung up in 6 different Mexican states, including Texas. And the Latino population of San Antonio was on board with the revolt. So we get the Texas Revolution, lasting from late 1835 to spring of 1836. It's over in a few months. It features the unsuccessful defense of the Alamo, the slaughter of some prisoners by the Mexicans at a place called Goliad, and the unexpected victory by Sam Houston over Santa Anna's army at San Jacinto in April of 1836. All right, so the Texians expected to be annexed by the United States immediately, but the timing was bad. Andrew Jackson was president, and Jackson had spent his entire adult life just salivating over the idea of adding Texas to the Union, but the timing is bad. It's the end of Jackson's second term. He's not seeking a third, of course. He wants his fair-haired boy, Martin Van Buren, to get elected, and you don't want the issue of Texas annexation coming up in the campaign because that's going to be about the extension of slavery beyond where it already existed. Explosively controversial even then. So all the Texians got out of Jackson was a diplomatic recognition on his last day in office in 1837. What I'm telling you here is that the Texians set up a republic. They were rebuffed by the United States, couldn't go back to Mexican rule, so they adopted a constitution and elected a president. That would be Sam Houston, and went into business. They achieved diplomatic recognition from Britain and France, who were eager to keep Texas independent. They would pay any price to make that happen. And the United States recognized Texas, and the population grew rapidly. Texas had a navy, carried on some military expeditions in the Southwest. But in all, they were rebuffed 3 times. Okay. As I told you, in the presidential election of 1844 in the United States, the annexation of Texas was an issue, and a man favoring that was elected. That would be James K. Polk. But the deal got done before he was sworn in. Now, in those days, they didn't swear in the new president until like March 4th. And in the interim, outgoing President Tyler found a way to get Texas annexed. It's one of his few accomplishments. The sticking point was that it was assumed that since Texas is an independent country, the instrument of annexation would be a treaty, a formal treaty, whereby one nation would surrender its sovereignty to another. Now, a treaty has to be approved by the U.S. Senate, and it takes a 2/3 vote to do that. You could get a majority, you could not get a 2/3 majority. There's simply too many Northeasterners, particularly from New England, who that's their worst nightmare, adding Texas to the Union. In fact, some of them preferred to spell Texas with 2 S's. If you want to know what statement they're making, I suggest you simply write it out and look at it, and it will come clear to you. Here's what Tyler did. A little bit of legal chicanery. He proposed that they just pretend that Texas is really just a territory seeking admission as a union, as a state in the Union. That doesn't take a formal treaty. That just takes a joint resolution of both houses, called an act of admission, just simple majority. So that's what they did. The Texans weren't upset about it, got the deal done. So by that method, Congress, by joint resolution, accepted Texas into the Union as the 28th state. It took a while to work out the details. I think it was like December 29th, 1845, Texas became the 28th state. That had already been set in motion by the time Polk took office. Now, that's not the boundary dispute. The boundary dispute is, where is the southern boundary of Texas, which is now a state, meaning southern boundary of the United States. Now, when Texas was a Mexican state, the southern boundary was the Nueces River, which empties into the Gulf at Corpus Christi. You know where that is, I hope. Now, Texas, however, when they had the president of Mexico as a prisoner after the Battle of San Jacinto, got a little bit greedy and moved the boundary south to the Rio Grande. Okay, at most it's about 150 miles from Corpus down to what's now Brownsville. That's the disputed area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. Okay, Polk wants all of it. So he realized we're not going to get that. He probably could have. That area is not that important to him. What's important to him is California. He's also promised to annex California or purchase California from Mexico. I just purchased it from them. Now, if you think about it, countries don't usually sell parts of themselves to other countries. But nobody in Mexico, and Mexican politics was kaleidoscopic with, endless chain of presidents and even an emperor one time coming and going with dizzying rapidity. Nobody will talk to him about it. So Polk realized the only way the U.S. will get California is if we should somehow get Mexico to attack us, and then we could defeat them in a war and acquire California. And the part about the southern boundary of Texas, that will be used to establish this provocation. So we'll take this up in the next video.